Maya Rodriguez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates painted their nails and talked about boys, she spent her afternoons at the local boxing gym, throwing punches at worn leather bags until her knuckles bled. Her father, a former Marine, had taught her that strength wasn't about size or gender. It was about heart and determination. At 22, Maya stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with calloused hands and scars on her knuckles that told stories of countless training sessions. She worked as a fitness instructor at the community center, but her real passion lay in mixed martial arts. Every evening after work, she would drive 30 minutes to Train Hard MMA Academy, where she had been studying Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, and wrestling for the past 6 years. The gym was a rough place filled with testosterone and the smell of sweat. Most of the fighters were men who initially dismissed her presence, thinking she was just another woman trying to get in shape. But Maya had earned their respect the hard way, through years of getting beaten up, getting back up, and proving that she belonged on the mats with anyone willing to test her. Her instructor, Carlos Mendez, was a former UFC fighter who had taken Maya under his wing after seeing her natural talent and incredible work ethic. He often said that Maya had something special, a combination of technical skill, mental toughness, and an almost frightening ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting. Maya's reputation in the local fighting community was growing. She had competed in several amateur MMA tournaments, winning most of her fights by submission or decision. Her ground game was particularly impressive. She had a knack for finding submissions even when opponents thought they were in dominant positions. Despite her success, Maya faced constant skepticism and condescension, especially from people outside the fighting world. Her co-workers at the community center often made jokes about her playing fighter, and her own family sometimes questioned why she chose such a violent hobby instead of settling down and starting a family, like her sister had done. The skepticism only fueled Maya's fire. Every doubt, every dismissive comment, every condescending smile became fuel for her training. She would channel that frustration into her workouts, pushing herself harder than ever before. Maya's life took an unexpected turn when she learned about a charity event being organized at the local military base. The event was designed to raise money for wounded veterans, and it would feature various demonstrations and competitions between military personnel and local athletes. The base commander had reached out to Train Hard MMA Academy, asking if they could provide some fighters for exhibition matches and training demonstrations. Carlos immediately thought of Maya, not just because of her skills, but because he knew she could handle herself in any environment. When Maya arrived at the military base for the preliminary meeting, she felt the familiar sensation of being sized up and dismissed. The soldiers and officers looked at her with barely concealed amusement, clearly wondering what this small woman was doing among the fighters and athletes. The meeting was held in a large conference room filled with military personnel of various ranks. At the head of the table sat Commander Jake Sullivan, a decorated Navy SEAL with 20 years of service. Sullivan was exactly what Central Casting would order for a military hero: 6 feet 2 inches of solid muscle, square jaw, steel gray eyes, and a presence that commanded respect the moment he walked into a room. Sullivan had earned his reputation through multiple deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, where he had led some of the most dangerous missions in SEAL team history. His men followed him without question, and his superiors trusted him with the most sensitive operations. He was known for his tactical brilliance, his physical prowess, and his ability to remain calm under the most extreme pressure. As the meeting progressed, Sullivan outlined the various events planned for the charity fundraiser. There would be obstacle course competitions, marksmanship demonstrations, and several combat sports exhibitions. He explained that the goal was to showcase military training while raising money for a worthy cause. When Carlos introduced Maya as one of his top fighters, Sullivan's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. His eyes briefly flicked over her small frame, and the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. It was the same look Maya had seen countless times before, the look of someone who couldn't quite believe that someone like her could be a serious fighter. The moment passed quickly, but Maya caught it. She had developed a sixth sense for these reactions over the years, and she could feel the dismissive energy radiating from Sullivan and several of the other military personnel in the room. They were professional enough not to say anything openly disrespectful, but their body language spoke volumes. Sullivan continued his presentation, explaining that the combat demonstrations would be handled primarily by military personnel, with the civilian fighters serving more as training partners and demonstration opponents. The implication was clear. The military members would be the stars of the show, while the civilians would play supporting roles. Maya listened quietly, her expression neutral, but inside she was already calculating. She had been in this position before, surrounded by people who underestimated her, and she knew exactly how this story would unfold. The only question was when and how she would get the opportunity to prove herself. As the meeting concluded, Sullivan approached Carlos to discuss the specific details of the demonstrations. Maya stood nearby, close enough to hear their conversation but apparently invisible to Sullivan, who spoke as if she weren't there. Sullivan suggested that they might want to pair Maya with some of the smaller soldiers for the demonstrations, commenting that it would be more appropriate and realistic for the audience. The condescension in his voice was subtle but unmistakable, and Maya felt her jaw clench involuntarily. Carlos, to his credit, politely suggested that Maya was capable of working with opponents of any size, but Sullivan waved off the comment with a dismissive smile. He had clearly made up his mind about what Maya was and wasn't capable of, and no amount of discussion was going to change that. As they left the base that evening, Carlos could see the fire building in Maya's eyes. He had worked with her long enough to recognize the signs. She was entering what he privately called her proving ground mindset, where every slight and every doubt became ammunition for an explosive demonstration of skill. Maya drove home in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. She had faced this kind of dismissal before, but something about Sullivan's casual condescension had struck a particularly raw nerve. Maybe it was his absolute confidence in his assessment of her, or maybe it was the way he had spoken about her as if she were a child playing dress-up. Whatever it was, Maya knew that this charity event was going to be more than just a fundraiser. It was going to be an opportunity to settle a question that had been following her throughout her fighting career. Just how good was she really? And what would it take for people like Commander Sullivan to take her seriously? The stage was set for a confrontation that would surprise everyone involved, including Maya herself. The charity event was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, and Maya spent the entire week leading up to it in intense preparation. Her training sessions became even more focused and aggressive than usual. She worked on her takedowns with renewed determination, drilling the same movements hundreds of times until they became second nature. Carlos noticed the change in her intensity immediately. Maya had always been a dedicated student, but now there was something different in her approach. A cold, calculating precision that he had only seen in professional fighters preparing for championship bouts. She was visualizing something specific, and he suspected it involved Commander Sullivan. Maya's training partners at the gym began to feel the difference too. During sparring sessions, she was more aggressive, more willing to push the pace and test her limits. She spent extra time working on her ground game, particularly focusing on techniques that would work against larger, stronger opponents. The night before the event, Maya lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios in her mind. She had no illusions about what she was walking into, a military base filled with elite soldiers who would be expecting her to play a supporting role in their demonstration. The smart thing would be to go along with their expectations, do her part professionally, and collect her appearance fee. But Maya had never been particularly interested in doing the smart thing when her pride was on the line. She had built her entire fighting career on proving people wrong, and Commander Sullivan's dismissive attitude had awakened something primal in her competitive spirit. The morning of the event, Maya arrived at the base early. The organizers had set up a large outdoor area with bleachers for spectators, multiple demonstration areas, and a central competition space that looked like a professional fighting venue. Military families, local dignitaries, and community members were already beginning to arrive. Maya checked in at the registration table and was given a schedule of events. She was listed for 2 demonstration sessions, one showing basic self-defense techniques and another participating in a friendly sparring exhibition with military personnel. The language was carefully chosen to make it clear that these were demonstrations, not competitions. As she warmed up in the designated athlete area, Maya observed the military participants preparing for their various events. The SEALs, Marines, and Army Rangers moved with the confidence of people who had never seriously questioned their physical superiority. They joked easily with each other, their camaraderie evident in every interaction. Commander Sullivan arrived wearing military fatigues that somehow looked more crisp and professional than everyone else's. His presence immediately commanded attention, and Maya watched as other military personnel straightened up slightly when he passed by. He moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the most capable person in any room. During the opening ceremony, Sullivan addressed the crowd with a brief speech about the importance of supporting wounded veterans. He spoke eloquently about sacrifice, service, and the bonds forged in combat. Maya had to admit that he was an impressive speaker. His words carried the weight of genuine experience and conviction. The first few events proceeded exactly as Maya had expected. Military personnel dominated the obstacle courses, marksmanship competitions, and strength challenges. The crowd responded enthusiastically to displays of military prowess, cheering loudly for particularly impressive performances. Maya's first demonstration went smoothly. She worked with a female Marine to show basic self-defense techniques, and the crowd appreciated the practical nature of the instruction. But Maya could sense that she was being treated as an instructor rather than a fighter, someone there to teach rather than compete. The atmosphere changed when it came time for the combat sports demonstrations. A boxing ring had been set up in the center of the main area, and several military personnel were scheduled to face off against each other in light sparring sessions. The energy of the crowd shifted as people anticipated seeing these elite warriors test their skills against each other. Sullivan was scheduled to participate in one of the main demonstration matches, facing off against a Marine Corps martial arts instructor. As Maya watched him warm up, she had to acknowledge his obvious physical capabilities. He moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had spent decades honing his combat skills. The sparring session between Sullivan and the Marine was impressive. Both men displayed excellent technique, conditioning, and tactical awareness. Sullivan ultimately dominated the match, using superior footwork and timing to control the engagement. The crowd erupted in appreciation for the display of skill. As Sullivan exited the ring, sweating but barely winded, he caught sight of Maya in the athlete area. For a moment, their eyes met across the space, and Maya saw something in his expression that confirmed her suspicions about his opinion of her capabilities. Carlos approached Maya as the next demonstration was being set up. He had been watching the crowd's reaction and could sense the energy building toward something bigger than simple demonstrations. The audience was getting excited about the combat sports, and the military personnel were feeding off their enthusiasm. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of the event organizers, apparently caught up in the excitement of the crowd, approached Maya with a microphone in hand. He was a retired Army colonel who had been tasked with keeping the energy high throughout the event. "Ladies and gentlemen," the colonel announced to the crowd, "we have a special treat for you. We've got a real professional fighter here with us today, Maya Rodriguez from Train Hard MMA Academy. Maya, would you like to show our audience what civilian mixed martial arts training looks like?" Maya felt every eye in the venue turn toward her. The invitation was clearly meant to be ceremonial, perhaps a brief demonstration of techniques or maybe some light sparring with a predetermined partner. But as she looked out at the crowd of military personnel and their families, Maya realized she had been presented with an opportunity. "I'd be happy to demonstrate," Maya replied, her voice carrying clearly across the space. "But I think a real demonstration requires a real opponent." The colonel smiled nervously, clearly not expecting this response. "Well, I'm sure we can find someone appropriate for—" "I'd like to spar with Commander Sullivan," Maya interrupted, her voice steady and clear. The effect of her words was immediate and electric. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Military personnel turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from amusement to disbelief. Someone in the crowd actually laughed out loud. Sullivan himself looked genuinely surprised for the first time since Maya had met him. He had been toweling off from his previous match, and now he stood frozen with the towel in his hands, processing what had just happened. The colonel looked back and forth between Maya and Sullivan, clearly uncertain how to handle this unexpected development. The crowd buzzed with confused murmurs and scattered laughter. The idea of this small woman challenging one of the most decorated SEALs on the base struck many people as absurd. Maya stood perfectly still in the center of the attention, her expression calm and determined. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and she felt a strange sense of peace about it. Whatever happened next, she had made her intentions clear. Sullivan stepped forward, his expression shifting from surprise to something that might have been amusement. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I appreciate the enthusiasm," he said, "but I don't think that would be appropriate. Maybe we could find you a more suitable partner." The dismissal was polite but absolute, and it was exactly what Maya had expected. The crowd began to murmur approval of Sullivan's reasonable response, and several people nodded at his mature handling of an awkward situation. But Maya wasn't finished. She had spent years being told what was and wasn't appropriate for her, and she was tired of accepting other people's limitations. "With respect, Commander," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet venue, "I think the audience would prefer to see what a real challenge looks like, rather than another predetermined demonstration." The gauntlet had been thrown, and everyone present knew it. Maya had just publicly challenged one of the most respected warriors on the base, and the crowd's energy shifted from amusement to genuine anticipation. Sullivan's expression hardened slightly. Maya had put him in an impossible position. Declining would look cowardly, but accepting would mean fighting a woman half his size in front of hundreds of people. The moment stretched out, filled with tension and possibility, as everyone waited to see how the decorated SEAL commander would respond to this unexpected challenge from the small civilian fighter who refused to know her place. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Maya could feel the weight of every gaze in the venue, from the military families in the bleachers to the elite soldiers surrounding the ring. She had created a moment that demanded resolution, and there was no backing down now. Sullivan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Maya recognized the expression. She had seen it on countless opponents' faces over the years when they realized she wasn't going to make things easy for them. It was the moment when dismissive amusement transformed into something more serious. The crowd began to sense the shift in atmosphere. What had started as an awkward moment was becoming something else entirely. Whispered conversations broke out among the spectators, and Maya caught fragments of what people were saying. "Is she serious?" Someone muttered from the bleachers. "She's got to be kidding," came another voice. "Sullivan's going to destroy her," laughed a soldier standing near the ring, but Maya also noticed other reactions. Carlos was watching her with a mixture of pride and concern, knowing exactly what she was capable of, but also understanding the enormous pressure she had just placed on herself. Some of the other fighters from her gym were nodding approvingly. They had seen Maya in action and knew she wasn't making idle boasts. Commander Sullivan stepped closer to Maya, his voice low enough that only she and a few nearby people could hear. "Miss Rodriguez, I understand you want to make an impression, but this isn't the time or place for what?" Maya interrupted, her voice equally quiet but carrying an edge of steel. "For a real test of skill? For finding out who's actually better instead of just assuming?" Sullivan's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been respect. Maya had just questioned not only his assessment of her capabilities but the entire hierarchy that placed him automatically above her in any physical confrontation. The retired colonel holding the microphone looked desperately around for guidance. This was clearly beyond his pay grade, and the situation was rapidly moving beyond his control. The crowd's energy was building and people were beginning to take sides. "Come on, Commander," shouted someone from the military section. "Show her what a real warrior looks like." "Don't hurt her too bad, Sullivan," called out another voice, followed by laughter. But Maya also heard other voices, quieter but no less significant. A woman in the crowd called out, "Go get him, girl," and a few people applauded. The reaction wasn't universal mockery. Some people were genuinely curious to see what would happen. Sullivan looked around the venue, processing the situation with the tactical mind that had kept him alive through countless dangerous missions. He could see that declining the challenge would create problems. The crowd was expecting action, and backing down from a civilian half his size would raise questions about his confidence in his own abilities. More importantly, Maya had framed the challenge in terms of skill rather than gender. She hadn't asked for special consideration or accommodation. She had simply demanded to be tested by the best available opponent. In Sullivan's warrior culture, that kind of direct challenge carried weight. "All right," Sullivan said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the venue. "If that's what you want, Miss Rodriguez, I'm willing to accommodate you." The crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers, surprised gasps, and nervous laughter. Maya felt her heart rate spike, but her expression remained calm. She had gotten what she wanted, but now she had to deliver on the promise implicit in her challenge. The colonel quickly began explaining the rules to the crowd, emphasizing that this would be a light sparring session with protective gear and strict safety protocols. But Maya could see in Sullivan's eyes that he wasn't planning to take it easy on her, just because cameras were rolling and children were watching. As they prepared for the match, Maya went through her pre-fight routine. She visualized her game plan, focusing on the techniques that had served her best against larger opponents. She would need to be perfect. One mistake against someone of Sullivan's caliber could end the fight immediately. Carlos approached her during the preparation time, his expression serious. "You sure about this, Maya? You don't have anything to prove to these people?" Maya shook her head. "Yes, I do. Not to them, to myself. I've been talking about being as good as anyone for years. Now I get to find out if that's true." Sullivan was going through his own preparation ritual, and Maya noticed that he was taking this more seriously than his earlier demonstration match. He was stretching more carefully, moving through technical drills with increased focus, and his team of military advisors was giving him specific tactical advice. The realization hit Maya that Sullivan had decided to treat this as a real fight, rather than a demonstration. The casual dismissiveness was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of a professional warrior preparing for combat. In a strange way, this was exactly what she had wanted, to be taken seriously as an opponent. As they entered the ring, the energy in the venue reached a fever pitch. The crowd had swelled as word spread throughout the base about the unusual matchup taking place. Military personnel who had been attending other events began filtering in to witness the spectacle. Maya looked up at Sullivan across the ring and felt a moment of genuine intimidation. In the confined space of the ring, his size advantage seemed even more pronounced. He stood relaxed but ready, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes focused and calculating. But Maya had been in this position before, facing opponents who were bigger, stronger, and more experienced. She had learned to turn that disadvantage into motivation, to use her opponent's confidence against them. The referee, a senior military martial arts instructor, called them to the center of the ring for final instructions. "This is light sparring," he emphasized. "No strikes to the head, control your power, and I want you both to prioritize safety above all else." Maya nodded, but she could see in Sullivan's eyes that his definition of light sparring might be different from the average person's. He was planning to test her, to push her to her limits and see how she responded under pressure. As they touched gloves in the center of the ring, Sullivan leaned in close enough for only Maya to hear. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said quietly. Maya met his gaze steadily. "I guess we're about to find out." The referee stepped back, raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent in anticipation. Maya could feel her heart pounding, but her mind was crystal clear. She had spent 6 years preparing for this moment, not specifically for fighting Commander Sullivan, but for proving that size and assumptions meant nothing when skill and determination were on the line. "Fighters ready?" The referee called out. Both Maya and Sullivan nodded. The referee's hand dropped. "Time!" The crowd erupted as Maya and Sullivan began to circle each other, each looking for the perfect opportunity to establish dominance in what was about to become much more than a simple demonstration. Maya had challenged not just Sullivan, but the entire assumption that physical size determined fighting ability. Now she had 60 seconds to prove her point, with hundreds of skeptical eyes watching every move. The stage was set for a confrontation that would surprise everyone present, including Maya herself, with just how far she was willing to go to earn the respect she had been seeking her entire fighting career. The real test was about to begin. The first few seconds of the match unfolded exactly as most of the crowd expected. Sullivan moved forward with measured confidence, his footwork textbook perfect, his hands positioned in a classical boxing stance that spoke of decades of training. Maya circled to her left, staying light on her feet, looking small and quick against his imposing presence. Sullivan threw the first strike, a controlled jab aimed at Maya's midsection that was more about establishing range than causing damage. Maya slipped it easily, moving her torso just enough to let the punch whistle past her ribs. The crowd murmured appreciatively at her defensive skills, but the general expectation remained that Sullivan would gradually take control. Maya responded with a quick leg kick that snapped against Sullivan's lead thigh with surprising force. The sound of the impact carried clearly across the venue, and Sullivan's expression shifted slightly. The kick had more power behind it than he had expected from someone her size. They continued to circle and probe for the first 30 seconds, each fighter getting a feel for their opponent's timing and reactions. Sullivan was clearly the more technically polished striker, his punches crisp and his movement economical. But Maya was faster, her footwork more unpredictable, and she seemed completely unintimidated by the size differential. The crowd was fully engaged now, their initial amusement replaced by genuine interest in the tactical battle unfolding before them. Even the military personnel who had dismissed Maya were beginning to pay serious attention to her movement and technique. Sullivan began to press the action, throwing more combinations and attempting to use his reach advantage to keep Maya at the end of his punches. He landed several light shots to her body, each one drawing appreciative nods from the crowd who could see his technical superiority in the striking exchanges. But Maya wasn't trying to win a striking contest. She had spent 6 years developing her ground game specifically because she knew she would always be at a disadvantage in stand-up fights against larger opponents. Her strategy was patient and deliberate. Let Sullivan establish his striking dominance, then take the fight where her advantages would matter most. The opening came when Sullivan threw a particularly aggressive combination, stepping forward to increase his power. Maya ducked under his right cross and shot forward, driving her shoulder into his midsection in a perfectly timed takedown attempt. Sullivan's wrestling background kicked in immediately. He sprawled backward, preventing Maya from completing the takedown, and the crowd cheered his defensive awareness. But Maya had expected this response. As Sullivan sprawled, she adjusted her grip and used his momentum against him, transitioning smoothly into a single-leg takedown. For a moment, they struggled in positions that highlighted the dramatic difference in their physical strength. Sullivan's leg muscles bulged as he tried to maintain his balance while Maya clung to his leg with grim determination. The crowd was on its feet now, sensing that something significant was happening. Sullivan managed to hop backward on one foot, keeping his balance and preventing Maya from completing the takedown. He landed several light punches to her back, trying to convince her to abandon her grip. But Maya had been in this position countless times before, and she knew that persistence often mattered more than strength. She adjusted her position slightly, getting her head to the outside of Sullivan's leg, and then executed a picture-perfect trip that sent both fighters crashing to the mat. The crowd gasped as Sullivan hit the ground with Maya on top of him, her years of grappling training immediately evident in how quickly she transitioned to a dominant position. Sullivan's ground game was competent but not exceptional by modern MMA standards. His military training had focused more on practical combat applications than sport grappling, and he found himself in unfamiliar territory as Maya began working her way into a more controlling position. Maya passed his guard with smooth efficiency, moving from position to position with the fluidity of someone who had drilled these transitions thousands of times. Sullivan tried to buck her off and get back to his feet, but Maya's base was too solid and her weight distribution too perfect. The crowd's energy shifted dramatically as they realized what they were witnessing. This wasn't going according to script. The small civilian fighter was not only holding her own against the decorated SEAL commander, she was controlling him. Sullivan attempted to roll, using his strength advantage to try to reverse their positions. For a moment, it looked like he might succeed, his superior upper body strength allowing him to bridge powerfully and create space. But Maya had anticipated this response, and she used his momentum to transition smoothly into side control. From side control, Maya began working for a submission. Her hands moved with practiced precision, seeking the grips and angles that would allow her to apply leverage against joints and pressure points. Sullivan defended intelligently, keeping his arms close to his body and his chin tucked, but Maya's technical knowledge was evident in every adjustment she made. The venue had fallen into an almost eerie quiet. The crowd watched in fascination as Maya systematically broke down Sullivan's defenses, moving from one submission attempt to another with the patience of a chess master, working through a complex endgame. Sullivan was beginning to show signs of fatigue. Defending against skilled grappling required constant muscle tension and mental focus, and Maya's relentless pressure was starting to wear him down. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he fought to prevent her from securing a dominant grip. Maya attempted an armbar, sliding her leg across Sullivan's chest and falling backward to hyperextend his arm. The crowd gasped as Sullivan's arm was briefly trapped, but his defensive instincts kicked in and he managed to clasp his hands together, preventing Maya from isolating the limb. But the armbar attempt had been a setup. As Sullivan focused on defending his arm, Maya smoothly transitioned to a triangle choke, sliding her leg across his neck and locking her ankle behind her opposite knee. The movement was so fluid that many spectators didn't immediately realize what had happened. Sullivan found himself caught in one of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu's most fundamental submissions. Maya's legs were wrapped around his neck and one arm, cutting off the blood flow to his brain. He had perhaps 10 to 15 seconds before the choke would force him to tap out or lose consciousness. The crowd erupted as they realized the situation. The small woman who had been dismissed and laughed at was now moments away from submitting one of the most elite warriors on the base. The impossible was happening right before their eyes. Sullivan struggled desperately against the choke, using every ounce of his strength to try to break Maya's grip or find an escape. His face began to redden as the blood flow to his brain was restricted, and his movements became more frantic. Maya maintained perfect technique, keeping her hips elevated and her legs tight around Sullivan's neck. She had been in this position hundreds of times before, and she knew exactly how much pressure to apply and how to adjust if Sullivan found a temporary escape. The referee moved closer, watching carefully for signs that Sullivan was in serious distress. The rules of the demonstration clearly stated that submissions should be released before causing injury, but the intensity of the moment had transformed this from a simple exhibition into something much more significant. Sullivan made one final, desperate attempt to escape, bridging powerfully and trying to lift Maya off the ground. For a moment it looked like his strength might save him, but Maya adjusted her position slightly and locked the choke in even tighter. Sullivan's eyes began to flutter and his struggles became weaker. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the reality of the situation became undeniable. Commander Jake Sullivan, decorated Navy SEAL and respected warrior, was about to be submitted by a woman half his size in front of hundreds of his peers and subordinates. The referee raised his hand, preparing to stop the match before Sullivan lost consciousness. Maya felt Sullivan's resistance weakening and knew she had seconds to make a choice that would define not just this moment, but everything that came after. The entire venue held its breath, waiting to see how this impossible confrontation would end. Maya felt Sullivan's body going limp in her triangle choke, his struggles becoming weaker as the blood flow to his brain was restricted. The crowd was completely silent now, the magnitude of what they were witnessing finally sinking in. This wasn't supposed to happen. The natural order of things was being turned upside down before their eyes. She could feel the exact moment when Sullivan's pride finally broke. His hand moved toward the mat in the universal gesture of submission, ready to tap out and acknowledge defeat. Maya had won. She had proven her point in the most definitive way possible. But something made her hesitate. Maybe it was the memory of every condescending smile she had endured, every dismissive comment about her size and gender. Maybe it was the laughter she had heard from the crowd when she first issued her challenge. Or maybe it was simply the competitor in her refusing to accept a victory that came with asterisks and excuses. Instead of releasing the choke when Sullivan's hand moved to tap, Maya made a split-second decision that would haunt both of them for years to come. She adjusted her position slightly, loosening the triangle just enough to allow blood flow to resume, keeping Sullivan conscious but completely controlled. Sullivan's eyes cleared as the blood returned to his brain, and he realized with growing horror that Maya had deliberately kept him conscious to prolong his humiliation. The hand that had been moving toward submission froze in midair as he understood the message she was sending. Maya leaned forward, her mouth close to Sullivan's ear so that only he could hear her words over the stunned murmur of the crowd. "You thought I was just some little girl playing fighter," she whispered, her voice deadly calm. "Did you think I would let you tap out easy and pretend this was just a lucky submission?" Sullivan's face flushed with a mixture of oxygen deprivation and pure rage. He had been in life-or-death situations around the world, had faced enemy combatants and survived impossible odds, but he had never experienced the particular humiliation of being completely dominated by someone he had dismissed as irrelevant. Maya began to systematically tighten and loosen the triangle choke, keeping Sullivan on the edge of consciousness, while demonstrating her complete control over the situation. Each time he began to fade, she would ease the pressure just enough to keep him aware of what was happening. The crowd began to realize that something had gone beyond the bounds of normal sparring. This wasn't a demonstration anymore. It was a statement being made in the most public and humiliating way possible. Military personnel shifted uncomfortably as they watched their respected commander being systematically broken down by a civilian half his size. Carlos watched from the sidelines with growing concern. He knew Maya's capabilities better than anyone, and he could see that she had entered a dark place mentally. This wasn't just about winning anymore. This was about revenge for every slight, every dismissive comment, every person who had told her she didn't belong. Sullivan made another desperate attempt to escape, using every technique he had ever learned about ground fighting. But Maya's technical knowledge was simply superior in this realm. She countered each escape attempt smoothly, maintaining her dominant position while continuing to control the choke. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical domination. Maya was forcing Sullivan to experience complete helplessness in front of everyone who looked up to him. Every second that passed was another crack in the aura of invincibility that had surrounded him throughout his military career. "Tap out," Maya whispered again, tightening the choke momentarily before loosening it. "Show everyone here what you really are when you don't have rank and reputation to hide behind." Sullivan's training kicked in as he realized that Maya was no longer interested in a clean victory. She wanted to humiliate him completely, to strip away every advantage except pure fighting skill. His survival instincts, honed through decades of combat, finally overrode his pride. Sullivan began to fight dirty, trying to grab Maya's hair and using small joint manipulation to create pain and distraction. But Maya had been expecting this escalation. She adjusted her position and applied the triangle choke with sudden, vicious efficiency. The crowd gasped as Sullivan's body convulsed briefly before going completely limp. Maya had choked him unconscious in front of hundreds of people, including his own subordinates and family members. The silence that followed was deafening. The referee immediately signaled for the match to stop, but Maya held the choke for several more seconds before releasing it. She wanted to make absolutely certain that everyone present understood what had just happened, Commander. Jake Sullivan had been completely dominated and rendered unconscious by a woman he had dismissed as unworthy of serious consideration. Medical personnel rushed into the ring as Maya slowly stood up, her expression calm and professional. Despite the brutality of what she had just accomplished, Sullivan remained motionless on the mat for what felt like an eternity before his eyes flickered open and he began to regain consciousness. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of shocked silence and scattered applause. Some people were clearly disturbed by the intensity of what they had witnessed, while others were genuinely impressed by Maya's technical superiority. The military personnel looked uncomfortable, unsure how to process seeing one of their most respected leaders so thoroughly defeated. As Sullivan slowly sat up, assisted by medical staff, Maya extended her hand to help him to his feet. It was a gesture that could have been interpreted as sportsmanlike, but given what had just transpired, it felt more like a final insult. Sullivan looked at her outstretched hand for a long moment before accepting it, allowing Maya to help him stand. His legs were unsteady and his face was pale from the oxygen deprivation he had experienced. But it was his eyes that told the real story, the absolute shock of someone whose fundamental assumptions about himself and the world had just been shattered. Maya stood beside him in the center of the ring, barely breathing hard despite the intensity of the match. The contrast between them was stark, Sullivan looking defeated and disoriented, while Maya appeared completely composed and in control. The referee raised Maya's hand in victory, and the gesture seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the crowd. Applause began slowly and then built to a crescendo as people processed what they had just witnessed. It wasn't universal. Many military personnel remained silent, but enough people were clapping to make it clear that Maya had earned genuine respect through her performance. Carlos entered the ring with a mixture of pride and concern. He had watched Maya accomplish something extraordinary, but he also knew that she had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The way she had prolonged Sullivan's humiliation went beyond competitive spirit into something darker. Sullivan finally found his voice as the medical staff finished checking him over. He began. then stopped, clearly struggling to find words for what had just happened to him. Maya looked at him steadily. "That was a real fight," she said simply. "Not a demonstration, not a friendly sparring session. A real test of who's better when everything else is stripped away." Sullivan nodded slowly, still processing the implications of his defeat. His entire identity had been built around being a superior warrior, and Maya had just proven that his assumptions about superiority were fundamentally flawed. As they left the ring together, the crowd continued to buzz with excitement and confusion. What they had witnessed was more than just an upset victory. It was a complete reversal of expected roles and outcomes that challenged fundamental assumptions about strength, skill, and who deserved respect in the fighting world. Maya had gotten what she wanted, unqualified acknowledgement of her capabilities from the most skeptical possible audience. But as she walked through the crowd of stunned military personnel and their families, she began to realize that sometimes getting exactly what you want comes with consequences you never anticipated. The victory was complete, but the real aftermath was just beginning. The aftermath of Maya's victory was unlike anything she had experienced before. As word spread throughout the base and into the local community, her life changed in ways she never could have anticipated. The video of her choking out Commander Sullivan went viral within hours, shared across social media platforms with headlines like, "Tiny Woman Destroys Navy SEAL," and "David vs. Goliath. Female Fighter Chokes Out Military Hero." The reactions were as divided as they were intense. Maya became an overnight sensation in certain circles. Feminist groups celebrated her as a symbol of female empowerment. Martial arts communities praised her technical skills, and social media influencers used her story to discuss everything from gender roles to military culture. But the backlash was equally fierce. Military supporters accused her of disrespecting the armed forces. Some claimed the fight had been staged, and a disturbing number of comments focused on threats and personal attacks rather than her fighting abilities. Maya found herself at the center of a cultural debate she had never intended to start. The most difficult part was seeing how her victory had affected Sullivan personally. In the days following the charity event, stories began emerging about the commander's state of mind. Fellow officers reported that he had become withdrawn and introspective, questioning his own capabilities in ways that were unprecedented for someone of his stature. Maya learned from Carlos that Sullivan had requested extended leave from his duties, citing the need to reassess and retrain. The proud warrior, who had once commanded the absolute respect of his subordinates, was now struggling with fundamental questions about his identity and place in the world. 2 weeks after the fight, Maya received an unexpected phone call. Sullivan wanted to meet with her privately, away from the media attention and public scrutiny that had surrounded both of them since that Saturday afternoon. They agreed to meet at a neutral location, a small coffee shop in a neighboring town where neither of them was likely to be recognized. Maya arrived first, choosing a corner table where they could speak without being overheard. When Sullivan walked in, she was shocked by his appearance. The confident, imposing figure she remembered from the base had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely haunted. He had lost weight, his usually perfect posture was slightly slumped, and his eyes held a uncertainty that she had never seen before. "Thank you for meeting me," Sullivan said as he sat down across from her. His voice was quieter than she remembered, lacking the commanding presence that had once filled rooms. Maya studied his face, looking for signs of anger or resentment, but found only a deep sadness that made her unexpectedly uncomfortable. "How are you doing?" she asked, genuinely concerned despite everything that had happened between them. Sullivan laughed bitterly. "How am I doing? I've spent 3 weeks replaying that fight in my head, trying to understand how everything I thought I knew about myself turned out to be wrong." He paused, staring into his coffee cup. "Do you have any idea what it's like to have your entire identity destroyed in front of hundreds of people?" Maya felt a pang of guilt that surprised her. She had wanted to prove herself, to earn respect through her skills, but she hadn't fully considered the human cost of her victory. "I didn't set out to destroy anything," she said softly. "I just wanted to be taken seriously." "By humiliating me?" Sullivan's voice carried an edge of anger for the first time. "By choking me unconscious in front of my men, my family, everyone who had ever looked up to me." Maya met his gaze steadily. "By proving that skill matters more than assumptions. By showing that respect should be earned through ability." not given automatically because of size or rank or gender. Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful rather than angry. You're right about that, and that's what makes this so difficult. I can't even be angry with you because you proved your point completely. I did dismiss you. I did assume I was better without any real evidence. And when it mattered, when everything was stripped down to pure skill, you dominated me. The admission hung between them, raw and honest, in a way that surprised both of them. Maya had expected anger, demands for a rematch or attempts to explain away what had happened. Instead, she was facing a man who was genuinely wrestling with the implications of their encounter. I've been thinking about that moment when you had me in the triangle choke, Sullivan continued. When you loosened it just enough to keep me conscious. You could have let me tap out cleanly, could have taken your victory without the extra humiliation, but you chose to prolong it. Why? Maya considered the question carefully. It was something she had been thinking about herself, trying to understand what had driven her to push beyond simple victory into something more vindictive. Because I was tired, she said finally. Tired of being dismissed, tired of having to prove myself over and over again, tired of people like you deciding I wasn't worth taking seriously based on how I looked rather than what I could do. In that moment, I wanted you to understand what it felt like to be completely powerless, to have someone else control your fate based on their assumptions about your worth. Sullivan nodded slowly. I understand that now, and I understand that I deserved it. Not because I'm a bad person, but because I was operating from a place of arrogance and prejudice that I didn't even recognize in myself. The conversation continued for over an hour, with both of them sharing perspectives and emotions that they had never expected to discuss with each other. Sullivan talked about how his military training had conditioned him to make quick assessments of people's capabilities, and how those assessments had become unconscious biases that he had never questioned. Maya shared her own struggles with constantly having to prove herself in a world that seemed determined to underestimate her. She talked about the exhausting process of earning respect fight by fight, gym by gym, always knowing that one bad performance would be used to justify dismissing all of her previous achievements. As their conversation wound down, Sullivan made a request that surprised Maya completely. I want you to train me, he said. I want to learn the techniques you used, understand the gaps in my ground game, and become the kind of fighter who could actually challenge you. Maya stared at him, processing the implications of what he was asking. You want to train with me? After everything that happened? Because of everything that happened, Sullivan replied. You exposed weaknesses in my fighting ability that I didn't even know existed. You showed me that there are levels of skill and knowledge that I haven't reached yet. If I'm going to continue calling myself a warrior, I need to address those gaps. Maya felt a mixture of respect and sympathy for the man sitting across from her. It would have been easier for him to make excuses, to claim that the fight had been a fluke or that the rules had somehow favored her. Instead, he was choosing the much harder path of acknowledging his limitations and working to overcome them. It won't be easy, she warned. Learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at your level, starting from the basics while unlearning habits you've built over decades of military training. And doing it with me, specifically, after what happened between us. Sullivan's expression was resolute. I don't want easy. Easy is how I ended up in this situation in the first place. I want to understand what real skill looks like. And you're the best teacher I could ask for. Maya found herself agreeing to the arrangement, though she insisted on certain conditions. The training would be private, away from the media attention that still surrounded both of them. Sullivan would have to check his ego at the door and accept being a beginner again. And most importantly, he would have to understand that she wouldn't hold back just because of his rank or reputation. As they shook hands on their agreement, Maya realized that her victory over Sullivan had accomplished something she had never intended. It hadn't just proven her own capabilities. It had forced both of them to confront their assumptions about strength, skill, and what it meant to be a true warrior. Fight that had begun as a challenge to prove her worth had evolved into something much more complex, a relationship built on mutual respect earned through honest confrontation with uncomfortable truths. Maya had wanted to be taken seriously as a fighter, and in achieving that goal, she had discovered something unexpected about the nature of real strength and the courage required to face one's own limitations. The training sessions that followed would test both of them in ways that their public confrontation never could. But they would also forge a bond based on the kind of authentic respect that could only come from seeing each other at their most vulnerable and determined to grow. 6 months later, Maya and Sullivan stood facing each other on the mats of a private training facility, both breathing heavily after an intense sparring session. The transformation in both fighters was remarkable, though in very different ways. Sullivan had embraced his role as a student with the same intensity he had once brought to military operations. He arrived early for every training session, stayed late to drill techniques, and approached each lesson with the methodical determination that had made him successful in special operations. His progress was impressive. The natural athleticism and tactical mind that had served him in combat translated surprisingly well to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu once he learned to set aside his preconceptions about how fighting should work. Maya had evolved as well, though her changes were more subtle. Teaching Sullivan had forced her to articulate the intuitive understanding she had developed over years of training. Breaking down complex techniques for someone with his experience and intelligence had deepened her own knowledge and made her an even more complete fighter. Their training relationship had not been without challenges. In the early weeks, Sullivan's pride had repeatedly gotten in the way of his progress. He would muscle through techniques instead of using proper leverage, try to impose his strength, advantage rather than accepting his position as a beginner, and become frustrated when Maya effortlessly countered his attempts to use size and power to overcome her technical superiority. Maya had been forced to repeatedly humble him during those early sessions, submitting him with the same systematic precision she had used during their public confrontation. But instead of the vindictive satisfaction she had felt that day at the military base, these submissions became teaching moments, opportunities to show Sullivan exactly where his approach was flawed and how proper technique could overcome physical advantages. The breakthrough had come during their 4th week of training. Sullivan had been attempting to pass Maya's guard using brute force, trying to pin her legs down with his weight rather than using proper technique. Maya had swept him easily, transitioning to mount position and threatening a submission. Instead of muscling his way out as he had done countless times before, Sullivan suddenly relaxed, accepted his disadvantaged position, and began using the defensive techniques Maya had been teaching him. It was a small moment, but it represented a fundamental shift in his approach, from trying to impose his will through physical dominance to working within the technical framework of the art. From that point forward, Sullivan's progress accelerated dramatically. He began to understand the chess-like nature of ground fighting, where positioning and timing mattered more than strength and aggression. His military background actually became an advantage once he learned to channel his tactical thinking into grappling, rather than trying to overpower his opponents. Maya found herself genuinely impressed by Sullivan's development as a student and as a person. The arrogant commander who had dismissed her based on assumptions had been replaced by someone who approached every technique with genuine curiosity and respect for the complexity of the art. He asked thoughtful questions, accepted correction gracefully, and showed a level of dedication that reminded Maya why she had fallen in love with martial arts in the first place. Their relationship had evolved beyond simple teacher and student. They had become training partners in the truest sense, pushing each other to improve while maintaining the mutual respect that had grown out of their initial confrontation. Sullivan's strength and athletic ability forced Maya to stay sharp and continue developing her own game, while her technical knowledge opened up entirely new dimensions of fighting for him to explore. The media attention surrounding their initial encounter had gradually faded, replaced by new viral stories and controversies. But within the martial arts community, word had spread about the unusual training partnership between the decorated Navy SEAL and the woman who had choked him unconscious. Some people viewed it with skepticism, others with admiration, but most simply recognized it as an example of how real growth could come from confronting uncomfortable truths. Sullivan's colleagues in the military had initially struggled to understand his decision to train with Maya. Some saw it as an appropriate response to a humbling experience, while others viewed it as unnecessary self-flagellation. But as Sullivan's overall combat effectiveness improved through his grappling training, even the skeptics began to acknowledge the value of what he was learning. Maya's standing in the fighting community had solidified into genuine respect rather than viral notoriety. Gym owners began inviting her to conduct seminars, female fighters reached out for training advice, and her technical knowledge became widely recognized among serious martial artists. The victory over Sullivan had opened doors, but it was her work as an instructor and continued development as a fighter that kept them open. On this particular evening, as they finished their training session, Sullivan brought up something that had been on his mind for weeks. "There's going to be another charity event at the base next month," he said as they gathered their gear. "The organizers have asked if we'd be willing to do a demonstration together." Maya looked at him with surprise. The idea of returning to the scene of their initial confrontation, now as partners rather than adversaries, carried significant symbolic weight. "What kind of demonstration?" "Teaching," Sullivan replied. "Showing people what we've both learned about assumptions, growth, and what real strength looks like. Not another competition, but an actual demonstration of technique and philosophy." Maya considered the proposal carefully. The scared and angry woman who had challenged Sullivan 6 months ago might have been tempted to gloat, to return in triumph, and remind everyone of her victory. But the person she had become through teaching and training with him understood that such gestures would miss the point entirely. "I think that could be valuable," she said finally. "Not as a victory lap, but as a way to show people what can happen when you're willing to question your assumptions and grow from uncomfortable experiences." Sullivan smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that would have been impossible to imagine during their first encounter. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." As they walked out of the training facility together, Maya reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them to this point. She had set out to prove that she deserved respect as a fighter, and she had accomplished that goal in the most definitive way possible. But the real victory had come afterward, in the patient work of building something constructive from a moment of confrontation. The charity demonstration a month later would indeed be successful, drawing an even larger crowd than the original event. But instead of witnessing a battle between opposing forces, the audience would see 2 skilled fighters working together to explore the deeper questions that their initial encounter had raised. Maya and Sullivan would demonstrate techniques, discuss philosophy, and answer questions from military personnel and civilians alike. The focus would be on growth, learning, and the courage required to acknowledge when your fundamental assumptions about yourself and others turn out to be wrong. More importantly, their partnership would become a model for how conflict could be transformed into collaboration when both parties were willing to approach their differences with honesty and mutual respect. The woman who had once felt the need to break a man's ribs to earn his respect had discovered something far more valuable: the possibility of building relationships based on authentic understanding rather than fear or dominance. The story that had begun with laughter and dismissal had evolved into something much richer and more complex. Maya had proven her point about skill and determination overcoming assumptions about size and gender. But in the process, she had also learned that the most meaningful victories came not from defeating others, but from helping them, and yourself, become better than you thought possible. Their training partnership would continue for years to come, each session a reminder that real strength came not from never being challenged, but from how you chose to grow when your limitations were exposed. Maya had wanted to be taken seriously as a fighter, and she had achieved that goal. But she had also discovered something unexpected about the nature of respect, growth, and what it truly meant to be strong.